Okay, get ready to dive into the world of laser weapons. You've sent over this really detailed Wikipedia article, and you want to know, are we talking about the future of warfare or just a sci-fi fantasy?
That's a question that's been generating debate for decades.
Right. And I think what I find so fascinating is how this technology feels like it's always teetering between, like, groundbreaking scientific ambition and those stubborn laws of physics that just won't budge.
Absolutely. The quest for a practical laser weapon really highlights that tension.
So the Wikipedia article dives right into some early projects, like the Tactile High Energy Laser or AirFay. It was a joint project between the U.S. and Israel, and their sights were set on some pretty ambitious goals, like taking down rockets and artillery shells mid-flight.
Yes, and the FEF project is a perfect example of how those early aspirations often encountered some hard limits. It was eventually canceled, wasn't it?
Yeah, scrapped back in 2005. And the article doesn't sugarcoat it, calling it bulky, expensive, and plagued by poor anticipated results. Not exactly a glowing review.
That sums it up well, though. That description gets at the core challenges that have always been there in laser weapon development. It's never just been about generating a powerful beam. It's about making a weapon that's practical, cost-effective, and effective in real-world situations. And that's where it gets really interesting because we have to talk about atmospheric blooming.
Atmospheric blooming. It sounds like something you'd see in a nature documentary, not a war zone.
Well, it's a bit less picturesque than that, but it's definitely a major hurdle for laser weapons. To understand it, imagine this incredibly concentrated beam of energy, your laser, traveling through the air. Now, we tend to think of air as empty space, but it's actually full of tiny particles. Dust, water vapor, you name it.
I'm guessing those particles don't play nice with lasers.
Not at all. When the laser beam hits these particles, it heats them up, and hot air expands, so you end up with these tiny pockets of heated air that act like a blurry lens in the path of the laser beam.
Essentially, the laser loses its focus.
Precisely. And that means it starts to spread out, losing its intensity and effectiveness. Instead of that concentrated beam that can, say, disable a missile, you have something that's lost a lot of its punch.
So how do you fix that? The article throws around some possible solutions, things like giant mirrors and something called phased arrays. What are those all about?
Let's start with those giant mirrors. Picture a telescope mirror, but scaled up to an almost unimaginable size. The idea is that these mirrors could help maintain the laser beam's focus over much longer distances. The problem is, mirrors of that size would be incredibly heavy, complex, and expensive to build, let alone to move and aim with the kind of precision you need in a weapon.
Not exactly practical, then.
Not yet, at least. Then there are phased arrays. Imagine a giant wall made up of thousands of tiny mirrors, all moving in sync to focus the laser beam like a giant invisible hand. That's essentially what a phased array does.
So kind of like those giant concert screens made up of a bunch of smaller screens?
Exactly, except instead of displaying images, they're directing a high-energy laser beam. Now, the concept is amazing, but the engineering challenge is immense. We're talking about coordinating the movements of thousands, maybe even millions, of these tiny mirrors with incredible precision. And then there's phase conjugate lasers, which sound like something straight out of Star Trek. Essentially, it's like bouncing your laser beam off a special mirror that undoes the distortion caused by the atmosphere.
Okay, so it sounds like we're still a ways off from a perfect solution. Would you say that overcoming atmospheric blooming is one of the biggest roadblocks for laser weapons becoming, a battlefield game changer?
Absolutely. Until we find a way to make these weapons consistently effective in all sorts of weather conditions and over long ranges, their practical applications are going to remain limited.
So much for my dreams of a Death Star.
Well, not necessarily. It's important to remember that not all laser weapons are being designed for large-scale destruction. There are other applications, like non-lethal weapons.
Yeah, like those dazzlers you hear about. Can you tell us a bit more about those?
Certainly. These lasers emit a powerful beam of light that's meant to temporarily blind or disorient a target, rather than causing permanent harm. They're often used by law enforcement and military forces for things like crowd control or to deter potential threats. One example is the PHASR rifle developed by the U.S. Air Force, which we can talk about in more detail later.
So even with non-lethal lasers, there are ethical and strategic considerations to keep in mind. It's not as simple as just pointing and shooting. Speaking of pointing and shooting, are there any laser weapons that have actually moved beyond the testing phase? I need to hear about some success stories here.
You are right to point that out. It's not all doom and gloom. There have been some notable success stories and niche applications, which is exactly where we'll pick up next. You're right, it's not all experimental setbacks and theoretical hurdles. There are some laser weapons out there making waves, so to speak.
Okay, I like where this is going. Give me some good news. What's out there that's actually working?
One of the most notable examples is the U.S. Navy's laser weapon system, or LAW-AUTHUS for short.
Loss is catchy. Do sailors just walk around saying, man, I wish I had my law DOSes on that drone?
I'd imagine naval terminology is a bit more formal than that, but the point is this is one of the few laser weapons that's moved beyond testing and is actually deployed on a naval vessel.
For real, this is happening now.
It is. It's been tested on the USS Ponce and more recently the USS Portland, and it's successfully taken out targets like small boats and, you guessed it, drones.
Hold up. It's engaging with real targets. This isn't some lab experiment anymore.
Exactly. Now, its range is still relatively short, about a mile or so, but it's a huge step towards seeing laser weapons used in actual operations. The article even describes it as 6 welding lasers strapped together.
6 welding lasers. That sounds simultaneously terrifyingly effective and like something out of a DIY YouTube video. Is that an accurate description?
It's a bit of a simplification, but it does highlight the underlying principle of combining multiple laser beams to get a much higher power output. Not exactly elegant, but sometimes a more brute force approach gets the job done.
Brute force seems to be a bit of a theme with laser weapons, huh?
It's true. The technology is still in its early stages. Many of the solutions we see today rely on raw power to overcome those limitations we talked about earlier. Take the Helio system, for example. It's also being developed for U.S. Navy destroyers, but boasts a 60-kilowatt laser.
So twice the power of law? Is that how this works? Double the lasers, double the fun?
Potentially double the destructive power, at least. But remember, it's not all about raw power. You need accuracy, reliable tracking, and you have to maintain the integrity of that laser beam over long distances. If you don't have those things, it's like having a really strong flashlight but shaky hands. Not very effective.
Makes sense. So we've got lasers at sea. What about land-based systems? Anything cool happening there?
Definitely. Shifting our focus to land, one fascinating example is Israel's Iron Beam system.
Iron beam. Okay, we're definitely in superhero territory now with these names.
It's a name that evokes a sense of impenetrable defense, and in a way, that's the goal. Iron Beam is a land-based system designed to intercept very specific threats, rockets, artillery, mortars, things that even Israel's other defense systems like Iron Dome might struggle with.
So it's like each of these laser weapons is being developed to counter a specific kind of threat?
Exactly. Iron Beam is all about addressing those close-range threats, engaging targets within about a 7-kilometer range. Not quite shooting down ICBMs, but a much more realistic and practical use of laser technology. And it's actually expected to be operational by the end of 2025.
So instead of trying to build the biggest, baddest laser to rule them all, it's more about strategically using this technology to address very specific security needs.
Precisely. And this trend of focused tactical deployments brings us to what's probably the fastest growing application of laser weapons today, anti-drone systems.
Nah, drones. Everyone's favorite unmanned target. So lasers are being used to shoot those down now. Tell me more.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, when it comes to anti-drone systems, we see a global push for laser technology. It's not just the US and Israel anymore.
Okay, so who else is getting in on the laser blasting drone action?
Well, Turkey has been very active in this field. They've been developing systems like the armaments, specifically designed to neutralize drones. And then there's Germany, with companies like Rheinmetall leading the charge. They're working on both stationary and mobile high-energy laser systems, also for countering drones. But their ambitions go beyond that, looking at helicopters, missiles, and even artillery.
It's like laser weapons are becoming the go-to solution for this new era of drone warfare. What about everyone else? Are other countries joining the laser weapon party, or are they sitting this one out?
Oh, they're definitely paying attention. The article mentions that China in particular is already developing specialized coatings that are designed to deflect laser beams.
Wait, hold on. They're building defenses against lasers. That sounds like they're anticipating a laser arms race.
It's a fascinating development, and it speaks to a crucial point about any kind of weapon development. It always triggers a counter-response.
So other countries like China, seeing these advancements in laser technology, they're not just sitting back and waiting to see what happens. They're already gearing up for what feels like a whole new kind of arms race, a laser arms race.
It's a fascinating dynamic, isn't it? China investing in countermeasures like these specialized coatings tells us a couple of things. First, they clearly see laser weapons as a serious threat, something they need to be prepared for in the near future, not just a far-off possibility. And second, it highlights this constant back and forth in military technology. Every action has a counter-reaction.
It's like a high-stakes chess game, except with lasers. So these coatings, what are they made of? Are we talking about some top-secret sci-fi material here?
It's not magic, but it is really clever engineering. You see, different materials interact with light in different ways. Some materials absorb light, some reflect it, and others let light pass right through. These coatings they're developing, they're designed to manipulate those properties, combining different materials in a very precise way to make a surface that can either reflect a laser beam or dissipate its energy.
So imagine you have this super powerful laser, but if it can't actually hit its target because of these coatings, it's not going to be very effective.
Exactly. And these countermeasures don't need to completely neutralize the laser, just make it less effective by some time, or force the attacker to waste a lot of energy to get the same result. It's this constant push and pull between offensive and defensive technologies. Remember those smoke screens we talked about earlier? Even something as simple as that can be surprisingly effective against a laser weapon.
Right. It's like throwing sand in someone's face during a laser fight. Not pretty, but it might just give you an edge. So where does this leave us? If we're not talking about Death Stars and planet-destroying lasers, what's the takeaway for someone who wants to understand how this technology might actually change warfare?
It's a great question, and it goes back to your initial point. Are we on the verge of a laser weapon revolution, or is this more science fiction than reality?
Right. Let's bring it all home. What's the verdict?
The reality, like most things, is a bit more nuanced than the way laser weapons are often portrayed in movies and video games. Remember all those epic blaster battles in Star Wars? Pure energy beams clashing in space?
Yeah. The pew pew pew.
Oh, exactly. And those depictions completely ignore the very real-world limitations that we've been discussing. Power constraints, the atmosphere messing things up, the development of countermeasures. Science fiction often glosses over those details for a more exciting story. But in reality, those limitations have very real consequences for how laser weapons can be developed and used.
So, no Death Star on the horizon.
Probably not anytime soon. But that doesn't mean laser weapons are a failure. As we've seen, they're already being deployed in specific scenarios, and those applications will only continue to grow as the technology improves. We're likely to see lasers playing a larger role in areas like short-range defense, neutralizing drones, and even non-lethal engagement.
So, less about destroying entire planets and more about targeted strikes and gaining a tactical advantage on a smaller scale. It's a different kind of warfare, for sure.
It is, and that brings us to something for you to ponder. Considering all the challenges and advancements we've talked about, do you think laser weapons will ever completely replace conventional weapons becoming the dominant force on the battlefield? Or will they mainly remain a complementary tool for very specific scenarios? It's a complex question with no easy answers, but it's something worth thinking about as this technology continues to evolve.
It's certainly given me a lot to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of laser weapons. For everyone listening, be sure to check out the show notes if you want to learn more about any of the topics we covered. And until next time, keep those lasers focused.